The hero's journey, the understanding of the hero's journey is that the best way to transmit information for people to understand information is through a story. And all stories have a sort of common framework, which Donald Miller calls the hero's journey, where you essentially have the hero of the story who has a problem, goes through a journey, undergoes a transformation, and comes out the end as the hero. There's the kind of narrative arc that all stories have. And the idea behind Donald Miller's story brand framework is that you can take that narrative arc, that framework, and apply it to your brand.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris-Beth Cowie, and I'm the founder of Empowered for X and the host of BizGrams. Here on BizGrams, we interview various entrepreneurs from our community to learn about their entrepreneurial experience and an opportunity for them to share tips and advice based on their subject matter expertise. Today, I'm super proud because we have with us Christopher Trotman from Trotman Communications, and he will be sharing some of his insights and tips on his communications journey. Christopher, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Can you tell our guests a little bit about yourself and what got you started on your entrepreneurial journey?
Sure. And thank you so much for having me, Chris-Beth. So, of course, you just said my name is Christopher Trotman, and I started Trotman Communications about 2 years ago. I had been working full-time at a community health center. And for those of you who don't know what a community health center is, it's a great concept, a multi-service hub that provides primary healthcare services as well as community services for communities that are disadvantaged in some way and can't access healthcare like you or I. I was working as a communications officer at a community health center, Access Alliance, when I recognized that there was a lack of communications and marketing expertise in the sector. And considering that community health centers, the way that they're funded, the bulk of their funding goes towards primary health care, not as much towards their community services, I thought that it only makes sense that they become more effective at telling their stories so they are able to more effectively and on a more consistent basis fund those community service programs that are benefiting the community in so many ways. So I spoke to my boss, the executive director at Access Alliance at the time, and asked if she would be comfortable with me transitioning into a part-time role so I could focus on providing service to other community health centers. Eventually, that evolved into me fully going into it, fully starting Trotman Communications, a boutique communication firm that provides marketing and communication services to not just community health centers and healthcare organizations, but really to not-for-profit organizations and not-for-profit hubs that are benefiting the community in a multitude of ways. So, I mean, that's really what it is. I've been doing communications for over 10 years, corporate communications professional. That's what I graduated from school. I went to the University of Windsor, graduated with a bachelor's degree in communication studies, and I graduated from Seneca College with a postgraduate degree in corporate communications management. So,
hey, that's a powerful story. You know, I can see the journey and the path that you've taken. I feel as though there's a love for communication along the way, and that just helped you flourish into the person that you are and the company that you're building, which is super powerful. And so for anyone that's, listening, you may need to get that corporate experience. You may need to get that, back-end experience to really then launch out on your own. And that, Christopher, I think in your story, you're just sharing that it wasn't like I immediately jumped into entrepreneurship. And sometimes that's the path people take. But as you mentioned, it was kind of gradual and moving into that space. So thank you so much for that. I guess one of the things you talk about nonprofit organization, and myself, my background started in working with nonprofit organizations. And what
Mm-hmm.
I oftentimes saw was that there's this dependency on grants and funding, and really the business model itself is not quite sustainable, because if
Mm-hmm.
the grants dry up or the funding dries up, organizations, we've seen far too many organizations having to close their doors in terms of moving and advancing the mission. I know one of the things you talk about and you're aware of is this concept of social enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to just talk to our viewers a little bit about what a social enterprise is, and what are some of the communication pieces that they should be mindful of when they are establishing one?
Sure. So, I mean, a social enterprise is a private business that within its mandate includes some sort of social benefit, some sort of social good. So, in the same way that a not for profit organization operates under the assumption that it's providing some sort of social good, and that's why it can pursue these grants and donations and is funded largely by the community and by institutions. For-profit enterprises, for-profit social enterprises can do the same thing. And that social good could be taking the profits and funneling it into a not for profit organization. Like some not for profit organizations will start a social enterprise, providing them with a source of revenue that is unrestricted, that they can use in the core areas of the organization that really need that funding without being inhibited by the requirements that a funder may place on the money being granted. Or a private individual could have an idea for a business that also has some sort of social good. So, an example of this may be an employment social enterprise that looks at vulnerable groups and seeks to employ folks from those vulnerable groups as a part of the business model. So, a social enterprise is a viable way to have a for profit enterprise, a for profit business that also gives back to the community in some really tangible way. And really, when developing a social enterprise, and I would say when developing a not for profit organization, the principles of good communication are the same. So you really want to know who your stakeholders are, who your target market is that you're speaking to, and develop communication pieces that speak directly to that target market. In the case of a social enterprise, that could look like being on social media, but not all social media channels. It's really, again, looking at your target market and asking yourself, where does my target market live? And choosing those social media channels. It's developing a website that speaks to your target market. And again, not speaking to everybody, but really focusing in on who is my target market and what am I trying to communicate to them through this website. In the past, it may have looked like developing flyers, posters, things like that. Perhaps not so anymore. You really want to focus more on digital communications. And for any organization, I really would encourage you to collect the email addresses of your customers or potential customers and develop a newsletter. Even a really basic newsletter that you're sending out once a month, once every 2 months, once a quarter, something to keep up regular communication with your contacts. And it's a channel that you own versus social media, where, God forbid, if you get kicked off your social media channel, you've lost all of those contacts. You no longer have a way to keep in touch with those folks versus a newsletter list and a mailing list, a website. Those are things that you own. So as much as you're relying on different channels that host your profile, like a Twitter or an Instagram or a Facebook, you also want to create channels that you own, that you have full control over. So as it relates to social enterprise, those are some of the things I would focus on. And before all of that, of course, just developing a communication strategy that outlines your goals, your objectives, your target stakeholders, and the different tactics that you're going to engage in to really speak to the target stakeholders in a way that moves forward those goals and objectives.
Awesome. Do you think in the nonprofit health sector, are the challenges that you briefly just highlighted, are they similar, different? What should people that run nonprofit organization in the health sector where you specialize, what are some of the things that they should be thinking about as they're building and developing their communication strategy?
Sure. So within the nonprofit health sector, I think, and part of the reason why I went into the nonprofit health sector as a focus is because there's a level of security there that doesn't necessarily exist in other areas within the nonprofit sector, like the arts, for instance, as just one example. And when I say that, what I mean is uh, CHCs get some level of core funding, which is not something that a lot of not-for-profit organizations can say. But that core funding is specifically for the provision of primary healthcare services. So because they offer primary healthcare services and healthcare is very much a need for the communities, they receive money to ensure that they can continue to operate those primary healthcare services to pay for the doctors, nurses, things like that. That being said, I would suggest that healthcare organizations and any organization that is receiving long-term core funding not rest on their laurels, because you never know when the funding environment is going to shift. When looking at the not-for-profit healthcare sector as an example, you can see that most pointedly in the shift away from local health integration networks as a funding model for community health centers, where essentially you had LINs, local health integration networks in different regions that funneled money from the provincial government to healthcare organizations. They were the local body that decided which organizations got money and how much. And they moved away from that model to a model where it's almost like a consortium, where it's a larger group that is looking at the region, which means there's less of a local view on the funding itself. So even for healthcare organizations where funding was fairly secure, where there was no real expectation of major shifts, the funding environment shifted immensely. And what this means is that there are organizations that may not be receiving the same level of funding as they once did. Looking at United Way as a major funder, when they shifted their own model of funding, there's a lot of organizations that got impacted, and organizations that perhaps used to receive core funding that no longer receives core funding. Again, the shift in the funding environment is not something that we on the ground level here can really predict. It's based on decisions that are happening in the background. So you want to ensure as an organization, you're constantly telling your story. From a healthcare perspective, that looks like telling the story of your clients in a way that is respectful. That's a way that's conscious and responsible, but really demonstrates the impact of the work that you're doing within the community. Because if you're not telling that story and just assuming that the good you're doing is recognized, acknowledged, and commonly understood, you're not going to be doing a good job of putting yourself in front of those people who are making the decision on the funding that affects your organization. So for organizations, whether you're in the healthcare sector or otherwise, I would say place a large focus on continually telling your story, trying to get your name in the news, in blogs, even if it's not there, telling your story on your website, on social media, telling the story of your clients, telling the story of your impact, such that people really know what you're doing and the impact of what you're doing.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that's so powerful. One of the things I know in our conversations, you've talked about the hero's journey, and or the brand story, using the framework of the brand story. I want to know if you could just elaborate on Donald Miller's concept a little and what it means to you.
Sure. So, I mean, I really love the idea of the hero's journey. I love stories. I'm a pretty avid reader. I've given myself a goal this year to read one book a week, which, I've already fallen behind on, but I think I'm up to book number 6 at this point. So I'm not too far behind, or book 5. Anyways, the hero's journey, the understanding of the hero's journey is that the best way to transmit information for people to understand information is through a story. And all stories have a sort of common framework, which Donald Miller calls the hero's journey, where you essentially have the hero of the story who has a problem, goes through a journey, undergoes a transformation, and comes out the end as the hero. There's the kind of narrative arc that all stories have. And the idea behind Donald Miller's story brand framework is that you can take that narrative arc, that framework, and apply it to your brand. And by doing so, you give people a better understanding of what your brand is, what the value of your service is, and they can see themselves as the hero in your brand story, as opposed to what a lot of organizations will do in placing themselves as the hero of their story, coming in to save the day. Rather, it's the customer that's the hero of the story and going through a journey and undergoing a transformation after having gone through that journey. The transformation that you helped them to achieve as the guide versus the hero of the story. So it's kind of like the customer is Luke Skywalker and you're Yoda for anybody who is a Star Wars fan out there. And I really
That
like this framework because it provides a very clear and understandable way for people to get their key message across to stakeholders, to customers.
Hey, no, that's so powerful. I honestly like that example because oftentimes as the entrepreneur yourself, you may want to be the hero in your story, but
Mm-hmm.
remember, we're starting businesses for our customers, really addressing the problem that they're facing. And as you pointed out, we're like the business owner, the entrepreneur is like the Yoda supporting the hero, the customer to achieve that. And no, I definitely agree. And, one of the things as a communications person, and helping my team, really formulate what is our communication strategy, how are we getting the story out of our, the impact that we're having. And I guess based on what you're saying, really thinking about impact, really thinking about the stories of our customers and showcasing that impact that we could be having on them and their businesses. So that's really powerful. Christopher, I have a couple more questions for you. One, what are some of the challenges that you have experienced as an entrepreneur and how did you overcome them?
Oh, I mean, we could probably do an entire podcast on challenges that I've experienced as an entrepreneur. Um, and for me, I think the main one is actually just staying motivated.
Mm,
Um, I think it becomes very easy as an entrepreneur to on days when things aren't going quite the right way, when you've gotten an email from a client that you didn't expect, or when a client didn't pay on time, or when you're having to deal with your own taxes at the end of the year, or with the administration, or when you're looking to scale up and trying to find the right person to bring onto your team to look at the challenges that are really inherent in just being a small business owner and ask yourself the question, is it really worth it? Could I be taking this time and this effort, putting it into a 9 to 5 job where I don't have to deal with the taxes, I don't have to deal with the headaches of clients' complaints and the impact that it might have on my business. I don't have to deal with an inconsistent stream of income. Even when things are going well, month to month may look different. There are things that you just have to deal with as a small business owner that you don't have to deal with as an employee. And there are days where that becomes tiring. And for me personally, I read, it's part of the reason why I read. I ground myself in habits that kind of put me into the right mindset. Because ultimately, as much as there are challenges being a small business owner, there are challenges of being an employee that I don't like. And there's a reason why I stepped away from that particular life. So I think it's just reminding myself of that, of establishing those habits that allow me to move forward even when I don't feel like it, um, and move past those challenges. Journaling helps with that as well, to just give perspective, because I can really take a look back and remind myself, why am I doing this? Why did I decide on this path in particular? What is it all for? Um, yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, and also just community. I actually found I've been able to find some really great communities, both in the projects that I'm working on outside of my business, and through some groups that I've joined, of small business owners and entrepreneurs that speak about their challenges. And I think it's a reminder that I'm not alone in this, that every small business owner faces this challenge. Same thing with books and reading biographies of some of the most famous people in the world. Even the most famous people in the world have faced challenges where they've really asked themselves the question, what is this all for? So just remembering that we're all on this journey. And while our stories are unique, they're not so unique that you can't find someone to relate to, and find comfort in that.
Hey, no, that's so powerful. And I guess that brings me to, what is one advice or tip that you have for entrepreneurs on their journey at this moment?
A tip for entrepreneurs on their journey at this moment. Um, I think the biggest thing that really helps me and is helping me as I dive deeper into it is have a plan. Um,
Mm,
I think when you ground yourself in a plan that lays out the actions that you're going to take, that makes very clear why you're taking those actions, that establishes goals that you want to reach, it makes it much easier to move forward. Because in the absence of a plan, you're kind of just creating the future as you move along, which means that there's nothing in front of you. And that can be a really, really kind of lonely and disturbing feeling. It's kind of like, imagine you're going on a drive and you haven't planned out the route and it's foggy and you have a sort of idea of where you're going, but you're not quite sure. It would be a pretty nerve-wracking experience because you have no kind of concept of what is the end. You don't know how long you're going to be driving. You don't know what turns you're going to be taking. You're just moving forward with an expectation that you're going to reach somewhere that's going to make you happy. And some people do that, and some people can find success in doing that. But I would say for the vast majority of us, it that would be a very nerve-wracking experience. And in fact, what is more effective is, even in the most rudimentary sense, developing a plan for yourself, saying in a year's time, this is the goal that I want to reach. And then breaking down that goal into its parts. To reach that goal, I need to take these certain actions. So that, again, on those days where you don't feel like doing anything, you have a clear set of actions that you can align yourself to so that you can keep moving forward. Um, yeah, and you have a clear idea of where you want to end up. Outside of that, I know you said one tip, but I'm going to give one more.
yeah.
Find a find a community. Find a community that you can ground yourself in, because the entrepreneur's journey, the small business owner's journey, is a lonely one. I kind of laughed when everything went into lockdown because I'm just like, well, I mean, I work from home anyway, so nothing's really changing for me here. um, and having a community of folks to kind of lean on has been super helpful and super enriching. And I look forward to the calls with those folks. So, yeah, find a community and have a plan.
Hey, no, that's so powerful. Thank you so much for that. And my word is funepical. So fun and epic adventures, great and small,
Mm,
enjoyed for showing self-love or things that you do to make yourself, stay motivated perhaps. And if
hmm
you could share, what is a funepical thing that you do to express self-love?
Oh, so I mean, for me, that is 100% camping. Um, I am a pretty avid camper. Um, Last year, in the middle of the pandemic, when things looked like they were going to start going on for a while, I actually went on my first solo camping expedition. I went solo portaging in Killarney, Ontario, for not super long, for about three days. It was a great time. Some people were certainly confused to see a black man on a solo canoe in the middle of the woods, but life. And every year, at least once a year, I go on a portage trip with a group of friends of mine. And for me, it's just a great way to recharge. It's a physical challenge. We go on pretty long portages, and it's just beautiful. There's nothing like being out in the middle of the woods with no one around you. to kind of clear your mind and put perspective on life.
Hey, no, that is so powerful. As a fellow camper, I have not yet done portaging, but that is fun ethical indeed.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I know you mentioned you've read 5 books. Any of those books you'd like to share with people in terms of books that they should consider adding to their book list and reading?
Sure. So the book I just recently finished was Song of Solomon. And it's gonna escape me who that. I'm actually terrible with the name of authors. That one was by, one sec, I have it here myself. I should know this. Toni Morrison. Really great book, kind of historical fiction with a kind of splash of fantasy, a little hard to get into. It kind of is confusing in the beginning, but once you get used to the characters and the thrust of the story, it's really a great read. I read Obama's latest book, Promised Land. Amazing book. So long. My God, that is a very long book. And it's not done. I think he's coming out with a part 2 and maybe a part 3, but it's a great book. I would definitely recommend picking that up. Another book that I read was, I recently read Think and Grow Rich. I think that's the name of the book, by Napoleon Hill. The version I got was not the greatest. The margins were like non-existent and the text was super tight together. I was just like, this is terrible to read. But the lessons of the book are timeless, and definitely, definitely recommend. A classic that I love is The Alchemist. If you haven't already read it, I read it last year, so it wasn't one of the 5 books I read this year. But I would definitely recommend it. And also you can follow me on Goodreads to see what I'm reading. But The Richest Man in Babylon is the last book I read, also about kind of personal finance and financial accountability. But if you haven't picked up that book, or even if you want a book for your kids or your teenagers, it's an easy read, a collection of stories, but really great lessons on personal finance and financial accountability. So.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And I actually love The Richest Man in Babylon. It is one of my annual books. I oftentimes listen to it again and again. The story is great. It's simple, as you mentioned, but definitely, yes, building those foundations around financial literacy and putting some good things into practice there. Christopher, it has been an honest pleasure having you here with us today. Tell folks how they can get in touch with you in terms of reaching out for communication tips, strategies, building, and support that you offer with your company.
Sure. So, I mean, the easiest way to find me is through my website, trotmancommunications.ca. I'm actually going through my own personal branding exercise. For the last 2 years, I've been somewhat underground and providing services to the community health sector, but not really pushing myself in terms of making those services very public. And that's changing. So if you go to my website, you'll see updates you'll start seeing updates on my blog. You'll see areas where you can find me on social media. But trying to be really intentional about what channels I'm on, so I'm reaching my stakeholders where they're actually at.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome. So we'll definitely put your website link and any additional social media stuff that we have in the chat so people can get those afterwards. It has been a wonderful phonetical family day, FF, yes. So fabulous phonetical family day. 3 Fs I got.
Oh my goodness.
But yeah, thank you so much.